So, yeah, I looked up one day and realized, oh, I haven't done an albums ranked video since literally last year. So, yeah, we're going to do that today. And today's artist will be none other than Abel Tesfaye, better known as The Weeknd. It kind of feels wrong for this album to be at the bottom, only because it's the album that really put The Weeknd in the mainstream lane with some of his biggest hits like The Hills, Can't Feel My Face, and Earned It. Those are all classics, I love those, but that's really the only reason I returned to this album, if I'm being honest. I remember being incredibly excited for Beauty Behind the Madness because it was his first major release after seeing mainstream success. Those songs really blew him out of the water. He had his mixtapes, and then Kissland was his debut, but Kissland didn't really hit as hard as maybe it should have. But Beauty Behind the Madness definitely was the one that made the pop sphere really pay attention to him. But once the album came out, I remember being disappointed, and I hate to say that, but that was my honest opinion of it at the time. And for the longest time, I couldn't figure out why I never vibed with this album the way I felt I should have. But this one, The Weeknd really had the unique task of softening himself enough for the mainstream, but not alienating his core fan base at the same time. And the result is something that kind of falls short, kind of falls in the middle, and it kind of doesn't do enough of either. It just doesn't, something's missing, and I could never really figure out why. It's not a bad album by any stretch of, anything. No, this is not a bad album, but it never really hit with me personally. Songs like Real Life and Losers and Acquainted, they all really feel like watered down versions of OG The Weeknd. But at the same time, they don't do enough to really stand out. And it's just kind of a bland album to me, if I'm being honest. And it always has been. It kind of has the same issue that Ariana Grande's My Everything does, where all the songs are good, but it doesn't really come together to do anything. And it's not very memorable overall compared to their other works. I'm a firm believer that an album is only as strong as its album cuts. Hit singles just aren't enough to uphold it. And if you take all the singles off this album, it's incredibly forgettable, even more so. I do like Tell Your Friends, Shameless, As You Are, and the Lana Del Rey collaboration. I love those so much. Those are favorites of mine. I honestly forgot that The Weeknd and Ed Sheeran even had a song together, because it's such a random collab, if I'm being honest, and it's definitely not something that I go back to. It's not bad, but it's not memorable to me in the slightest. Beauty Behind the Madness isn't a bad album. Again, it's not a bad album by any stretch, but I do think it's his most unremarkable compared to everything else that he's done. The Weeknd really is an artist whose albums are experiences, and they feel like big, they feel that he creates a world. And with this one, there was no theme. There was no thread connecting all the songs together. And again, not every album has to have some overall theme and some deep concept and world building and all that to be good. But for an artist like The Weeknd, who usually creates worlds with his albums, Beauty Behind the Madness more or less feels like a collection of songs to me more than anything. It's a decent album, but definitely his least memorable. I feel like I might upset some people with this one. The Weeknd, this ranking, I kind of feel like it has the same problem as my Mariah Carey one did, where I don't occupy that fandom as much. So I don't really know what the consensus is about certain albums, but I feel like Dawn FM being this low might ruffle some feathers. But all of my rankings, they usually have that one controversial placement. Before I even sat down and ranked these albums, I genuinely expected Dawn FM to be higher, but to be brutally honest, this album never 100% connected with me. I remember being very excited for this album when it was approaching its release, especially after Hours. But before you attack me, before I go any further, understand that this was my third favorite album of 2022. This was. The only reason it wasn't even any higher is because SZA put out SOS, and that was my second favorite, and Beyonce obviously put out Renaissance, and nobody was beating that. So this one was my third favorite of the year, but in the context of the Weeknd's albums, this one is on the lower end of the spectrum. I don't really go back to Dawn FM as much. It's more of a case of I like all of his other albums so much more, which ended up pushing this one down on the list more than anything. And first of all, after the absolute hurricane that was After Hours, I wasn't expecting a new album from him so soon. So Dawn FM was a nice surprise, but my initial reaction after my first listen to the record was, okay, that was nice, but I'd rather listen to After Hours. And that's just me being honest. What wins me over with Dawn FM and most of the Weeknd's releases, honestly, is the deliberate dedication to creating a cohesive musical experience and era. He's solidified that as part of his artistry, and that's why I love him so much. Everything about The Weeknd is carefully thought out and crafted, which is unheard of for most male artists these days, and just artists in general, honestly. Overall, though, I really didn't listen to this album half as much as I listened to everything above it. Specifically comparing it to its sibling album, After Hours, it just lacked something that album had, but I could never really put my finger on it. One thing I will say, that while both albums are some of the most cohesive experience I've ever listened to, After Hours is just more memorable overall and has a bit of more variety to it. Dawn FM leans heavily into its 1980s influences to the point that a lot of the album honestly kind of melds together to me. A good chunk of this album sounds the same. Not bad, it just kind of all blends together. But I do love that he's doing another trilogy of albums, and I'm very excited for what the final album will be. Speaking on songs that I do like Gasoline. I do like How Can I Make You Love Me. Sacrifice and Out of Time are they were in my top 10 The Weeknd songs, definitely. Take My Breath, I usually like his lead singles. Take My Breath didn't really connect with me. It just kind of sounded generic compared to other things that he's done. But I do like it. I do. It's just I didn't like it as much as, say, like Blinding Lights or Can't Feel My Face or even Starboy. But yeah, really, those are the only ones that really jump out at me. I like Best Friend. I like the remix with Summer Walker more. But other than that, like, there's not a song that I don't like on this album, I'll say that, but there's definitely not as many favorites on here compared to his other records. I feel like I'm one of maybe 5 people on the planet who actually remembers this release, but I was obsessed with My Dear Melancholy when it came out back in 2018. It was released during that rather long gap between Starboy in 2016 and After Hours in 2020. And this project is an EP rather than a full-fledged album, but artistically it's just so distinct that I always treated it as its own mini album/era. My Dear Melancholy was a nice return to OG The Weeknd. It had a very somber vibe reminiscent of his trilogy mixtapes and Kissland, but with the newer mainstream The Weeknd flair kind of dotted in there. Overall, this project was way too overlooked by the public, but I kind of feel like that was intentional on The Weeknd's behalf. Some things are just meant to be given to the world and dropped and just kind of left alone. And My Dear Melancholy is one of those releases that spoke for itself. He just put it out and just let the world have it and just let it go. In hindsight, I can hear bits of pieces of the sound that he would eventually adopt with After Hours after this. Call Out My Name and Wasted Times are top 10 Weeknd songs for me. The former being one of his best singles to date. That song, that you can hear the pain in that song. I love that song so much. Privilege is another one of my favorites. The two I just mentioned and Privilege are probably my top 3 on this record. Overall, this project was a welcome throwback coming off of an era as big as Starboy. And the only thing keeping it this low on my list is the fact that, it wasn't a full album or era, because I can guarantee you if this was a full record, it probably would have been like a Kissland 2, and it definitely would be higher up on my list. Next on the list is Trilogy, the collection of The Weeknd's first three mixtapes, and although they are all three separate releases, ever since they were re-released as one package, I just view them all thematically as one collective body of work in his discography. If you ask some people, this is the vibe and the style that The Weeknd should have always stayed with, and while I don't necessarily agree with that, these mixtapes are quintessential to who he is as an artist today. The Weeknd had a very distinct style and aura about his... Did I say aura? Aura. Ew. The Weeknd had a very distinct style and aura about his early music and persona that had his contemporaries and successors following suit. And a lot of rappers and fellow R&B singers alike owe a lot to The Weeknd. He was setting trends long before he broke into the mainstream. I have a lot of nostalgia with these mixtapes. They were the first time I felt like I'd gotten into an artist on the front end before the rest of the world even knew who they were, and that felt cool. You know, as a teenager, you want to be cool and hip and all that, and I felt like I was introducing everybody that I knew to The Weeknd. I was like, oh my god, you have to hear this. Oh my god, you have to hear this guy. You have to hear him. It was pretty revolutionary for me at the time to be into an artist that you would not hear on the radio, because you know I'm a pop boy. I like pop music. I like popular music, but I didn't waste any time, like I said, telling everyone about The Weeknd, and I vividly remember saying, oh, this guy is going to be huge, and I'm so glad to say that I was right. He's done more than I thought he would have done. I mean, the Super Bowl, all that. But back on topic, The Weeknd was already creating worlds with his music long before he even had a proper studio album out. House of Balloons is an absolute classic. It's a stellar way to kick off any music career. He really came out of the gate swinging with this one. House of Balloons can honestly stand next to his heavy-hitting albums like Starboy and After Hours, and it can hold its own, no problem. That's just how phenomenal this record is. It sounded like nothing else that was out at the time of its release, and to this day it still sounds very, very distinct. It was clear from the get-go just how unique The Weeknd was. What You Need should have been to The Weeknd what Thinking About You was to Frank Ocean, honestly. The title track, absolutely life-changing, a two-part masterpiece. Wicked Games was the general public's favorite. Coming Down and Loft Music are quite honestly two of my favorite songs of all time. And The Knowing, which was the final track on the original release, is a haunting number that had me in tears in high school, but I won't get into that. Thursday is the second mixtape out of Trilogy, and it's always been my personal favorite out of the three. This one is by far the mixtape I revisit the most, and there's not a single skip on this one. My favorites would have to be, though, the title track, The Zone featuring Drake, Gone, The Birds Part 2, and Heaven or Las Vegas. Last but not least, we get to Echoes of Silence, which is my least favorite out of the three, honestly. Although opening a mixtape with a Michael Jackson cover holds a lot of weight with me, obviously. I played the hell out of DD when it came out, and the subject matter of Dirty Diana was perfect for The Weeknd's aesthetic. Montreal is a career highlight, still a favorite of mine to this very day. I absolutely adore this song. Aside from those two, the rest of Echoes of Silence kind of underwhelmed me in comparison to House of Balloons and Thursday, but overall this trilogy has a very special place in my heart, and I rank it highly because we owe the entirety of The Weeknd's immaculate discography to these three mixtapes. It's where it all started, and he blew the doors off the hinges. Now, I know I call a lot of things underrated, but Kissland is absolutely underrated, and not just an underrated The Weeknd album, but an underrated album in general. I am unapologetically head over heels in love with this album. It's one of my favorites of all time. Really genuinely believe Kissland is top 3 Weeknd album. You know, you can argue about it with me all day long, and you can make valid points on all of it. I can see somebody saying that how dare you put Kissland above Beauty Behind the Madness, but Kissland is a great album. It really is. It was The Weeknd's proper debut album, something I remember highly anticipating because I was so excited for him to break into the mainstream like I'd hoped. And while his breakthrough wouldn't come until 2015's Beauty Behind the Madness, Kissland really felt like a sweet spot in the transition from mixtape able to mainstream able. Beauty Behind the Madness also somewhat falls into that category, but what makes it pale in comparison to Kissland is the fact that Beauty Behind the Madness felt inauthentic to me, honestly. It was further along in that aforementioned transition, with the core essence of what made me fall in love with The Weeknd still being present, but being lost in what really felt like his most uninspired album to me. Kissland was a natural successor to Trilogy, taking the best of all three of those mixtapes and elevating it. This album is honestly art to me. Kissland is a scary, haunting, dangerous place, and that doesn't have to be explained to the listener because you hear it from the get-go. I made a video a long time ago about this album, and I go into far more detail there, so please go check that out because that one wasn't really one of my more viewed ones. Understandably so, Kissland is not a big album. It's not one of his biggest albums. It's not Beauty Behind the Madness. It's not Starboy. It's not After Hours, but that does not mean it doesn't deserve the recognition that I think it deserves. It deserves recognition. It does, because this is a great, phenomenal body of work. I remember at the time, it came out around the same time as Frank Ocean's Channel Orange, and everybody was hyping up Frank Ocean's, rightfully so. Channel Orange is a great album, but nobody was talking about Kissland. And I remember I was on, what was that site? ATRL. If you're a real pop fan, you know what I'm talking about. ATRL. I was on there and I did a poll, and I said, Kissland versus Channel Orange, and like it was Channel Orange swept the whole thing, and everybody's like, "Are you crazy?" Blah blah blah. And I'm sitting here like, Kissland is great, y'all. Like, can we please give some love to Kissland? But anyways, concisely, The Weeknd has yet to release an album that has elicited the same feeling that I get from Kissland. Hell, no artist has put out anything that elicits the feeling I get from listening to this record. It's really an experience from start to finish. This is an album that you legitimately get lost in. The title track is unlike anything I have ever heard, ever. He could have put that song on After Hours and it would have felt right at home. Sure, Kissland does not have smash hits like Beauty Behind the Madness or Starboy or After Hours, but that doesn't matter to me in the slightest. I'm sure putting it this high on the list, again, is treason to some, but I don't care. I love this album. I will always love this album. I listen to it more than the next two. But the next two were just so monumental that I feel like they had to be at the top. But I do legitimately believe that they're up there. But Kissland will always be a special album to me. As I said before, Beauty Behind the Madness may not have hit the mark for me 100%, but all was forgiven when The Weeknd dropped Starboy in 2016. Releasing an album the same year as Beyonce's Lemonade and Rihanna's Anti is definitely a gamble, but mind you, everyone was releasing an album in 2016. Starboy was my third favorite album of that year, behind the aforementioned two albums. I do find it so funny that The Weeknd could easily top my yearly albums list, but he almost always releases the same year as Beyonce. He released Kissland the same year as her self-titled album, and then Starboy came out the same year as Lemonade, and then Dawn FM dropped the same year as Renaissance. But anyway, Starboy as an album was the first release from The Weeknd that you could feel him finally being comfortable with being in the spotlight. Beauty Behind the Madness felt a little off, partially due to the fact that it just felt jarring to see a previously notoriously reclusive person suddenly thrust into the forefront of pop culture. Early on, you could tell that he wasn't comfortable with the exposure, honestly. Starboy was, both thematically and literally, The Weeknd affirming and accepting his spot as a star, no pun intended. He'd finally found his footing in the new lane, along with far more confidence, and the relatively short gap between Beauty Behind the Madness and Starboy furthers my point that the former was crafted in the midst of a transitory period for The Weeknd. If you still hadn't caught on to The Weeknd by this point, Starboy was the album that made you fall in love with him. A phenomenal record from start to finish, no skips in sight, despite its longer length. Most importantly, though, The Weeknd had hit his mark with Starboy, most definitely. Aside from the title track, Party Monster is an absolute gem. I live for Lana Del Rey's backing vocals towards the end of the song. And speaking of Lana, Stargirl Interlude is something I can't put into words. I adore that little snippet of a song so much. Unfortunately, it suffers from the same issue as Rihanna's James joint and Miguel's Girl with the Tattoo, in that one of the best songs on the album is relegated to a mere interlude. False Alarm is a very underrated song from The Weeknd. I remember everyone hating that song when it came out, but I love how chaotic it sounds, honestly. Secrets is another favorite of mine. Die For You, obviously. The original and the Ariana Grande remix and I Feel It Coming are also my favorites from this record. It's hard to really pinpoint a definitive magnum opus for him, but it's definitely a toss-up between Starboy and my number one pick for this list. After Hours is a masterpiece of an album, one that feels like a creative peak for The Weeknd thus far. What I love most about this record and its accompanying era is the fact that he really invested in staying true to its theme and maintaining cohesion. After Hours is one of the most thematically exciting pop eras in recent memory, and it's even more outstanding because you just don't see artists investing in their eras like this anymore, especially male artists. That red jacket and his new fro are honestly trademarks of his now. He was wearing that jacket to literally every performance during this era, and a lot of people were joking, saying, you know, when is he going to get rid of it? But I admired that. I love that because of the commitment to the era and the theme. After Hours manages to still feel very much like a The Weeknd album, but elevated to the next logical step. It's a very theatrical album, fitting considering it was heavily inspired by film. There genuinely isn't a skip on this album to me. Every song hits. It doesn't feel too long or too short. It manages to be cohesive yet varied in its sound, something that I feel like its follow-up didn't quite capture as well. But it's hard to capture lightning in a bottle twice. Blinding Lights alone was a career-defining song, one that was so massive that it was quite literally inescapable. I distinctly remember they were giving that song heavy radio airplay almost 2 years after it came out. The After Hours era was the one that elevated The Weeknd beyond just another pop and R&B guy, to me at least. He became much more than that, and while I didn't like Dawn FM as much, again, I'm very, very excited to see what the final album is in this trilogy. As far as my favorites from this album, off the top of my head, Escape from LA, I love that song. I adore that song so much. That is peak Weeknd right there. Faith, amazing. Blinding Lights, obviously. Heartless, I wasn't a huge fan of Heartless. I'm actually mad that Heartless was the lead single just because I feel like Blinding Lights would have been a much better lead single. He put them both out very close together, so I guess it really doesn't matter, but still. Save Your Tears, of course, obviously. Speaking on the remix, I just think that was such a perfect way to end the era. It was a good send-off. I adore that song. That song does something to me. I love it so much. I will be honest, I didn't pay much attention to it until Ariana hopped on it. But still, like it made me appreciate it so much more. Also, the title track is phenomenal. It gives me Kissland vibes in a way, which I really adore. Hardest to Love is another good one. I'm probably forgetting some, but no, After Hours is one of my favorite albums of all time by far. Phenomenal record. Love it so much. Hey beautiful people, thank you so much for watching. So that was my The Weeknd albums ranked video. I'm excited to see your responses and your rankings and whether you agreed, what did you not agree with, tear me apart, go for it. If you made it this far and you enjoyed this video and you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing. I don't like to ask, I don't like to beg, but you know, if you like this, you know, stay tuned, there's more coming. I just wanted to real quick say thank you for all the support from my regular viewers and just for watching this video in general. I really appreciate it. I just was so focused on doing other videos that I just realized, I haven't done an albums ranked in a while. But yeah, give me some recommendations, comment, like, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.